Hi, everybody. I am going to talk today about the shift in the Southeast Mediterranean inorganic carbon cycle, going from proxy records into observational and some of the things that are going on there. Before I start, I think it's very important to note that this work is coming from a very long collaboration between myself and my long-term partner on this, Dr. Gaius Ventura from IOLR. And none of this would be possible if we wouldn't have had this collaboration going. And you will see our names interchanging on the references as I'll go through the talk. So what am I going to talk about? First, about acidification in Levant Basin. What's been going on from the 50s to the 2000s. And then about the shift of the Levantine Sea from being a CO2 sink to a CO2 source as of the 2000 onwards. Our research area, the Southeastern Mediterranean Sea, and specifically the Levant Basin, the corner that's marked on the meta-atlas dataset at this quadrant DL4. And if I have to describe this area with 3 words, these will be warm, saline, and oligotrophic. And oligotrophic is kind of important here, because if we think about the carbon cycle and how it behaves, we bring carbon from the atmosphere, dissolve it, it goes into the biological system, and from there it drops down, gets remineralized, and goes through all of the various sort of interactions. But in the Levant Basin, things are a bit more different. And because it's so oligotrophic, biology is not such a big deal as it might be in other places. And the dissolve side, or the alkalinity pump, plays a much bigger role. Now, additionally, as I started with, it's also warm. It's very, very warm. Warming has been ongoing in this region for a while now, and we're talking about 2.5 degrees since the 1850s. And there is some discrepancies between various records, but the warming rate is about between 0.5 to 1 degrees per decade, which for lower latitudes is just unbelievably high. And this warming occurs mostly in summer, but we're also seeing an ongoing warming in winter. So the entire curve is shifting towards warmer and warmer waters. And it's not just the surface. It's most amplified in the surface, but when we have big processes like the Eastern Mediterranean transient, we also see increase in temperature in the deep water themselves. So everything's getting warm. And on top of that, humans decided they need to add more stress to the system. And we see the stress in the form of the damming of the Nile. First damming were already in 1902, but the Aswan Dam, constructed in 1964, essentially blocks a lot of the transport of nutrients and sediment into the basin. But more importantly, it also blocks the supply of fresh water. And this resulted in a major shift in how the basin behaves at the surface with respect to salinity. If before the damming we would get the floods during summer, and we would see decrease of and summer would actually be the least saline period of the year. Now it's the most saline period of the year. So that's already a big shift with respect to how much alkalinity we have during maximum temperature and how much salinity we have during maximum temperature. And because we don't have a lot of biology going on, alkalinity is incredibly conservative. It essentially sits on a very nice line with salinity, and this has been replicated on multiple studies at this point, which is very handy. Because if we think of this entire system, we start our carbon story at the exchange between the surface and the atmosphere. And a lot of what defines how much the system can take with respect to carbon, the alkalinity pump of the side, is defined by alkalinity. But we didn't measure alkalinity until 30-something years ago. And before that, the record is also spotty. But we did measure salinity. Salinity has been measured for a long time. And because it's very conservative, we can just take salinity and transform it into alkalinity. which is very handy because that already allows us to track alkalinity in time. To get the other side of the story, to get acidification, we need at least one more parameter of the carbon system, because if we have two, we can calculate all six. Handy for us, humans have been burning fossil fuels. It's been doing a lot of mass to the system. It's been driving acidification, but hydrocarbons don't have the same isotopic signature as other CO2 sources. If we can figure out what's the addition of this anthropogenic hydrocarbon sourced CO2 to the system, we can calculate how much was added. And isotopes are very handy for that. So for measuring the delta C14 of DAC, comparing that to all the records, a little bit of data, a lot of math, we can generate a number which is called the RC value, or anthropogenic ratio of carbon. And with that, we can take a stable isotope record for delta C14, like the one we have here from the vermetite reefs. This was generated by Guy during his PhD. We can take what has been going on in the atmosphere. We can take the record that we have from the reef and back calculate out of that the change in DAC, the dissolved inorganic carbon. And with these two parameters, we can calculate all of them, all of the rest, including pH. And this results in this nice record going from the late 40s to the early 2000s. Before the damming of Aswan, there is a lot of noise in the system because the summer values makes things a bit more complicated. But if we look just at the black dots, which are the winter values, we don't really see any clear trend. After the damming, then we start seeing a very clear trend of acidification. That also corresponds with increase of atmospheric CO2. And that has a really nice clear trend, which matches the Mauna Loa record quite nicely. But, and there's a but, this record ends around the 2000s, where a lot of the vermetites just die off. And the pH value we got for the early 2000s, it falls within this gray band. And this gray band is the range of values now. This is what we've been measuring at sea in the past few years. So what's going on? How can over 20 years pH stays the same? Well, it's even worse. Superficially, if we look at a trend going from the 70s to the early 2000s, pH has been going down. But since then, it kind of looks like it's been going up. Not only that, alkalinity seems to be going up. What's going on? Originally, our original thought was, well, we're measuring it wrong. As you can see, there's different colors here because the data is coming from various different methods. We measured pH directly, we measured DAC and then calculated pH, we measured pH directly with a different method, and we said, oh, it might be just going between the different methods. That's where some of this noise is being added to the system. But as we were getting more data and we were getting a better picture of what was going on, we started to realize, no, pH is actually going up. And it's been going up at the same time as temperature has been going up, because DAC and dissolved PCO and PCO2 are very, very tightly connected to temperature. Remember, we don't have biology. What's been driving a lot of the system is thermodynamics. And basically what's been going on is it's getting so warm that during summer, we are losing CO2 from the system. The water becomes stratified, absorbs a lot of heat. The delta between the surface and below that shallow summer thermocline can be up to 8 degrees centigrade. And that pushes the dissolved CO2 system to supersaturation. And when it gets to that supersaturation, it pushes that CO2 goes out of the system and back into the atmosphere. Actually, so much of it is going out of the system that on the entire year budget, the system is a net CO2 source. It releases more CO2 than it takes on. And when we take CO2 down, then the entire system has to rebalance. And as it rebalances, alkalinity goes up and pH goes up. So we end up with an increase in pH, especially during summer. And this warming has been ongoing through the entire southeastern Mediterranean Sea. Oligotrophy is not unique to our part of it. So while it seems that, according to our math, that degassing in the Levant Basin has been the most extreme, basically the entire southeastern Mediterranean Sea is now a net CO2 source to the atmosphere. And I've done some sensitivity analysis on this. The warmer it's going to get, the more discharge we're going to get. And if we're going to get more extreme weather event with stronger wind, that's going to exacerbate the flux out. It's going to be balanced out by how much CO2 is going to be in the atmosphere, because we're going to increase, but we can only degas if there's more CO2 in the water than there's in the atmosphere. And as CO2 will build up, that's going to impact those fluxes as well. So, like I said, the flip side of this CO2 degassing is also an alkalinity shift. So you can see these two profiles from, I think these are from the 2018 cruises we did. In blue is winter, in red is summer. You can see the big gradient we form with the stratification of the surface water in summer. And with that, there's also a big decrease in dissolving organic carbon and an increase in alkalinity. A thing to consider with a higher level of alkalinity is that also means that there is a higher omega. That is, the saturation state of calcium carbonate is going up as well. And this gets to some interesting math. So this plot has omega on one x, temperature on another x, and these contour lines are the precipitation rate of aragonite. So if we live in a world that's being acidified, acidification is going to take precipitation rate down. But if we're also warming, the net result can actually be an increase in the precipitation rate. And that brings us back to this plot. So yes, we have CO2 coming into the water as DAC gets supersaturated. Some of that carbon goes back to the atmosphere. If we had a lot of biological activity, photosynthesis and respiration would recycle that DAC. But some of that DAC, through biological or abiological means, also transforms into mineral form, what we call the particulate inorganic carbon. And usually that's shells, but not always. Timor cats had sediment traps deployed offshore Hadera during 2015-2016. And we started seeing something really weird in those, and that in the summer of 2016, there started to be an aragonite flux into those traps during summer. And we know that this aragonite is not theropod because it comes with very high strontium level, which theropods generate low strontium aragonite, so that's not it. Well, maybe it's summer storms. Maybe those are resuspending. Well, we looked at the backscattering data from the ADCP there. Summer actually had very, very low backscatter, very low sediment load, so it's not likely resuspension. So what could it be? And our conclusion was, through looking at the other parameters, is this is probably abiotic. This is equivalent to whiting events we're seeing in the Persian Gulf and in the Bahamas. Indeed, this increase in aragonite flux corresponds very nicely to increase in the saturation state of aragonite. So if we go back to this plot I showed you earlier, and we say, okay, what's the shift between summer and winter? Well, we do have the effect of degassing. That brings omega aragonite from around 3.5 to around 4.2. That's a big shift already, giving us a lot of increase in potential increase in the precipitation rate. But we also have a lot of warming because the delta between summer and winter is very big. And the net result is an increase of, by a factor of 3, of the potential precipitation rate of aragonite. But this is something I think is always important to note. In carbonates, as in cooking, it's more about kinetics than thermodynamics. And we need to consider induction time. If we take a modern supersaturated salinity, a modern seawater, which is supersaturated with respect to aragonite, it's not going to precipitate anything. But if we give it seeding and we give it enough induction time, and for an omega of about 4.2, that should be in the order of 2 months, then we can get through that induction period and start generating and start nucleating aragonite. These brown bars here show you the consecutive days of this high aragonite state during the deployment period. And this is at 30 meters where we had the sensor. Further up the surface, this would have been potentially longer, because now we're seeing this very long summer with very strong acidification, continuing these periods for a very long time. And that essentially allows us to get enough time in supersaturation to get through induction and potentially generate this abiotic aragonite in the water column. What we think is going on is essentially we are going from winter with omega around 3.5, a mixed water column, to summer with very strong stratification, high omega, and formation of inorganic aragonite. Now, you'll notice the arrows for the CO2 here. In winter, we can have sink, but in summer, we're degassing. Part of it is the temperature, but the formation of the aragonite also contributes to A, acidification, and B, CO2 discharge. And based on the fluxes we've measured so far, about 16% of the summer degassing could be attributed to the formation of abiotic aragonite, which is quite a bit. After this was published, by the way, there was quite a lot of international interest. It's been covered by news outlets in Germany, in the US, and Japan. So I was quite happy about that. So going back to our plot here, this is currently our concept of how carbon behaves in the Eastern Mediterranean, with, from my perspective, mostly on the inorganic side. But there's one more thing that we have to consider. How can we degas more CO2 in summer than we are absorbing during winter? We'll need an extra source of carbon. And that source is probably lateral transport, which brings us particulate organic matter, maybe even dissolved organic matter, that can be respired, contribute DIC, and gives us some of the flux. And we can actually see this quite nicely in the water column. So this is very busy, but I'll try to go over what everything is. These are profiles from April 2018, showing from left to right: oxygen, DIC, salinity, pH, salinity, alkalinity, temperature, and DIC. And there's this very nice trend going from 0 to 600 meters, with decrease in oxygen paired with decrease in pH and increase in DIC, which might be the remineralization of organic matter. And that actually fits quite nicely with the depths Isha and Weinstein and Ilana were reporting for the lateral transport. But I'm saying there is acidification going down to the deep. It's very, very important to note, alkalinity in the entire basin is very high. If we look at any other ocean around 800 meters, we get to the point where alkalinity is low enough that omega aragonite goes below 1 and we go into dissolution. That is not the case in the Levant. Alkalinity in deep water is lower than the surface, but it's still quite high. We don't see any dissolution. And these beautiful pteropods shown here from pictures sent to me by Orit Jaimes from the Geological Survey are sitting at the seafloor intact. And just to illustrate this, this is a plot of omega aragonite versus total alkalinity in the same water depth window of 1000 to 2000 window in the Atlantic, the Indian and Pacific, and you see them clustered nicely in the lower left corner, and the Levant Basin all the way up in the right-hand corner. These are very saturated. These waters are still very saturated with respect to calcium carbonate. That's a topic we're still working on. So we're not dissolving carbonate, but we are transporting organic matter, both from laterally, but there is one more source. And that source is the seafloor itself. We know there are respiration at the seafloor, but we also know that particularly for the Levant Basin, we have seeps. We have sources of the DLC that is being respired and remineralized. And we actually went there and we tried to measure pH above the seeps. And in most cases, we didn't see a signal, but in one case, we did see a very strong signal in DAC. So there is an addition of dissolving organic carbon above some of these seeps. We still don't have a good quantification for that. That's something to continue work on. And I think with that, I'll wrap it up because we're supposed to do this only for half an hour. And I'll conclude. The inorganic carbon cycle in the Levant and the Southeast Mediterranean nowadays is primarily controlled by physical oceanography and thermodynamics, with inorganic chemistry governing much of the surface processes. Respiration as a source of the DAC is likely more important at depth. Warming and stratification have fundamentally changed the inorganic carbon cycle behavior in the region. Partially, it's mitigating acidification, but it does lead to degassing of CO2 into the atmosphere. So the net, with respect to that, isn't great. And that's it. Thank you very much.